Welcome to Our Voices. Terrorism once again made headlines as the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi warns Americans credible information indicates Westerners may be targeted by extremists in Kenya. In West Africa, Boko Haram killed 60 people in Nigeria's town of Ron. These attacks and others like them were carried out by men, but experts say there are women involved in all levels of terrorism, including the creation and dissemination of information. Today, we take a closer look at the radicalization of these women and men and ask if it is possible to recover and or remove themselves from these groups to combat the rise of terror on the continent. I'm Ayan Bior.
And I'm Oriani Tangishaka.
And I am Hadiza Kiari.
Hello there, I'm Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick. Imagine living on edge, not knowing precisely when or where a terrorist group might strike in your country. Well, that's the threat Kenyans are facing. Security agents there are still on the hunt for more suspects in last month's terror attacks in Nairobi. You'll remember 21 people died. And while that country is on high alert, there's a warning from security analysts that Al-Shabaab is changing tactics. Mohammed Yusuf is in Nairobi for us with this report.
Kenyan investigators searched a house northwest of Nairobi, where one suspect is believed to have lived. Neighborhood butcher Paul Kariuki says the named suspect Salim Guchunge had visited his shop many times.
I am in shock that a guy I know carried out the attack. I could not believe he did that. I'm surprised.
But not all neighbours of Guchunge are rushing to judgment. This woman, who do not wish to be identified, lives just a few blocks away.
We're quite uncertain about what is happening. It's quite shocking. It was very unexpected. We've been living with this guy in the same neighbourhood for the last, as I've had for the last 3 months. He was also on our WhatsApp group for the estate. Has made some contribution towards some of the activities and projects that we have.
The suspect's last message to the group, a comment on improving neighbourhood security. Somali terrorist group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for Tuesday's attack on the Dusit 2 hotel and office complex. Security analyst Mwenda Mbijiwe says the militant group is changing tactics to use so-called sleeper cells within Kenya.
They were able to camouflage and to hide and to stay among that community without anybody ever detecting that actually these people are living in our midst.
As Kenya mourns those killed and recovers from yet another terrorist attack, many will be asking how to stop these all too frequent tragedies. Mohammed Yusuf for VOA News, Nairobi.
Well, the latest there from Kenya. And just as Mohammed Yusuf asks, in that package, what many Kenyans want to know is how do you stop these attacks? It seems like the same groups are launching these attacks in the same places every single time. I mean, why do these attacks keep on happening?
Well, first, I just want to extend my condolences to the victims and the families of these victims. I can't even imagine what they're going through. But if we want to understand what's going on today, we have to look at the relatively short history of terrorism on the continent. Take Al-Shabaab, for example. They've grown in recent years. Boko Haram has gone down in recent years, but Al-Shabaab has grown. They've done that because of the situation in Somalia. At one point, they were considered a failed state, and they had no central government to really rein in terrorism. And AMISOM is there. AMISOM, the African Union, and the UN are there fighting terrorism. The U.S. has joined them. But Al-Shabaab was able to carry out the deadliest attack in 2017 when it killed 587 people in Mogadishu. And then, of course, we saw what happened in Kenya just a couple of weeks ago.
Right. I think Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya because they can. I mean, what we have here are highly motivated terrorists on a continent that's just peppered with soft targets. And I mean, look, I think in my view, they want two main things out of every single attack. They are looking for soft targets so they can incur maximum damage, and they want maximum media coverage. Yeah. Kenya is the perfect soft target in that sense. Look, it's easier for a terrorist, of course, to attack a mall in Kenya or a hotel in Kenya or in places like Tunisia because, you know, they have lucrative tourism sectors. And so it's easier to attack them there in those vulnerable spots than it is to actually launch an attack in the West. You're much likely to hit Western tourists at a hotel in Kenya. And so that's part of the reason I think we see Kenya bearing the brunt of these attacks. It's the perfect soft target, not just because of the tourism sector, but also it provides global visibility. Al-Shabaab launches an attack in Somalia. I mean, few people are going to take note, but they strike in Kenya. The world is going to take notice. That's perfect PR.
Yeah, that's part of a larger, sophisticated PR strategy that Al-Shabaab has. By the way, Al-Shabaab means the youth, so we know exactly who they're trying to target, and they're going where their youth are. They're on the internet, they're on Twitter, they have propaganda campaigns on YouTube, and they are trying to get Somalia to return to early Islamic teachings, and they're using the youth to get there.
You know, I don't necessarily think that every terrorist group should be associated with religion. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't hear supremacist group like the KKK being labeled as a terrorist group. Neither are they associated with any religion. And that's not to say that I support any of their ideologies in any way or form. As a matter of fact, in 2015, my own uncle was killed by Boko Haram while, you know, attending the mosque. You know, he was there to pray. So they pretty much targeted the timing where everyone would be there so that they could have, you know, maximum victims. Clearly, these groups are out to kill anyone, regardless of, you know, what religion you come from. The other thing I would like to point out is the fact that I don't see how we can talk about terrorism without talking about radicalization and, you know, recruitment by these extremist groups. And I want to make it clear that I'm a journalist. I am not expert on terrorism, neither am I an expert on radicalization. But we all know that it comes in different forms, and these groups, you know, depending on what group they come from, they target youths in different forms. And sometimes it could be triggered by the government. When people start to feel oppressed, or, you know, they feel you've been stripped of the ability to express yourself peacefully and in a lawful manner, there's a tendency that they might express themselves violently and unlawfully, and it could be a feeling of being marginalized.
That's true, and it's just interesting to see that sometimes a simple effects of the economy, what it's doing that causes people to be radicalized. It's very interesting. It's not just on the continent.
Yeah, and it's the same situation with the Niger Delta terrorist group in Nigeria, where they feel, you know, there's a need for them to kidnap people and kill, you know, innocent citizens just a simple fact that they feel like the government is not bowing down to their needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as you have said also, Ayan, I mean, some African countries are facing significantly a lot of challenges in terms of terrorism. I mean, in my view, I think that in 2007, when the U.S. decided that these terrorist acts were going to actually be, to make the case to begin the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, and, you know, I think that it just became another form of colonial style installation because of the many different type of sites that we see, military sites that we see on the continent. I mean, I respect and I honor the military men and women that are there in the forefront fighting the war on terror. And actually, I salute them. But I also think about the Africans that are constantly concerned about the amount of installation, the outposts, the different military bases that are on the continent, because it seems that they're springing up everywhere.
Yeah, but the very nature of terrorism demands for governments to work together. There isn't a single country in this world that can defeat terrorism on its own, the U.S. included. So it makes sense to me that the U.S. has a presence in Africa.
I agree, but on a continent of 53 nations, experts say that there are about 46 installations, and sometimes that can, you know, frighten investors. I mean, investors, if I have millions of dollars that I want to invest, let's say, in Uganda, and I hear the different military bases, the different nodes on State Department's website, I might not want to take my money there. So sometimes I think that these are the things that African leaders have to think about if we're going to move the continent forward.
Any country is going to do what is in its own national interest. Any country, United States, any African country. And it is in America's national security interest to combat terrorism anywhere it is happening in the world. Because what you don't want is lawless, ungoverned territory. That's exactly not what America wants to see. That puts America at risk. And, you know, often you look at these post-conflict situations, of which we have many on the continent. Libya after Muammar Gaddafi, Tunisia after the Arab Spring, and, you know, Mali throughout the Sahel. These are potential breeding grounds, and in many cases, actual breeding grounds for terrorist activity. These are recruitment opportunities as well. So all these lawless, ungoverned territories, that is exactly what we don't want to see, because that invites criminality. And terrorism, these terrorist activities, that's criminal activity. They're in the business of crime.
It's interesting that the U.S. has all this military presence everywhere, but then in Nigeria, for example, the citizens have wondered and questioned the fact that the United States has not come to the aid of Nigeria's Boko Haram insurgencies, especially the fact that there was this global campaign, Bring Back Our Girls campaign, and then the fact that also that Boko Haram have also gone further, having access to sophisticated weapons like drones, and so there are all these questions, and it is also obvious that the Nigerian military is incapable of being able to,
do it by themselves.
They can't do it by themselves. But the good thing about it is that the U.S. government has definitely announced $329 million on helicopters to help the Nigerian Air Force. So it is a welcoming development, but then the contention about it is the delivery date, which is 2024, and we know that
so we just have to wait a few years.
But I think there's a lot that's happening that we might not see or that is not really advertised. There are special forces in. I mean, everybody isn't going. This is asymmetric warfare. Everybody isn't. This isn't a war situation in every country, and sometimes there could be special forces or a lot happening that is just not visible to the eye or widely covered in the media. And so we also want to know what you think about this. Why do these terrorist acts keep happening, and often in the same places? We're, of course, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle there is @VOA Our Voices. Also, please do share our posts with your friends and your followers, and we obviously want you to bring them into the conversation as well.
Also, don't forget to use the hashtag VOA Our Voices.
Remember, we're on WhatsApp too, so send us your messages and videos. Our number is US country code +1 304 506 3638. So reach out to us and add your voice to this conversation.
And we want to remind you that you are the 5th person on this panel, and it's time for your voices to be heard. Here's what some of you have to say about terrorism on the African continent. We'll be right back.
Any chance of any government to ensure that the young people don't get into terrorism or being radicalized is by the formulation of good program for the youth themselves. As an example, a young person who's in school and have a job will not just think overnight to give it all up and try to go and blow up him or herself. But if that person has opportunities, if there are opportunities available for that person, I truly believe that that will minimize the chance of that individual to be involved in terrorism and being radicalized.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about.
Sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices.
With me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick.
And Hadiza Kiari.
And Ayan Bior.
And Orion Itangi Shaka.
Join us on Facebook at VOA Our Voices.
It's time for Our Voices.
Here with Our Voices, welcome back. The psychological effects of war, discrimination, or violent extremism can last for generations, but victims in several countries are being helped to get back to normal lives through innovative local programs. This provides needed counseling, as well as teaching some surprising skills. Faith Lapidus has an explanation in this report by Bob Morris.
These pieces of cloth being put together into a quilt tell stories, real stories about the trauma of war, discrimination, kidnappings. They were made by the victims who suffered but survived, or relatives of those who didn't. The stories come from many countries: Kenya, Bangladesh, Peru, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and anywhere else human rights abuses have taken place. The individual pieces of artwork are the result of local organizations providing therapy and skills training to the victims, mostly women. Each square tells of their nightmares, or sometimes their hopes for the future.
You feel the anger and the despair and just frustration and the difficulty of a life with the effects of the war and the particular weapons, which are the sexual assault and abduction.
The pieces are then assembled into quilts by volunteers in the United States. And the quilts go on display internationally. The effort is coordinated by a group called the Advocacy Project. Ian Guest is its executive director.
Many of these women have no education, but when they come together and they're offered the chance to talk about their experience, to express it through art and embroidery, they find a skill, and that is very exciting.
That's what Advocacy Project fellow Georgia Nicatora discovered during the summer she worked in Mali.
What I did see in Bamako was that the women really did benefit not only from the skills trainings that they received, but also and especially from being able to express their stories, talk to each other, and be in the company of women who had experienced similar situations as them.
The squares, whether embroidered, knitted, or woven, are powerful and personal messages about civil war and extremists. With continued display of the quilts, there could be less need to tell these terrible stories, and the people behind them will have changed the world for the better. For writer Bob Morris, I'm Faith Lapidus, VOA News.
That is such a beautiful way of overcoming radicalism. I mean, you know, with the exception of what we saw in Kenya recently, the East Central Africa region of the continent have actually seen a different type of radical acts. I mean, we've seen citizens becoming radicalized by joining rebel movements and actually fighting civil wars because of racial and ethnic tensions. I mean, we've seen it in Rwanda, in Burundi, in different places. A study done by the American Political Association, Political Science Association, have found that in terms of ethnic conflicts, what might solve it is that we should have ethnically integrated institutions. I mean, having like quotas in the military or sharing of power in the government. And they have said that these can actually remove prejudices between the ethnic groups. They actually, interestingly enough, used Burundi as a prime example of one of the nations in Africa that have been able to achieve that. What we see in Burundi is that they have actually really cohesively integrated every institution, ethnicity in every institution. The law says that if a president is Hutu, a vice president must be a Tutsi, and vice versa. I mean, actually, even in the military, 50% must be Tutsi, 50% must be Hutu. And they've actually gone a few months ago in freezing a lot of the NGOs, asking them that they must level their ethnic quotas so that no groups feels marginalized.
Now I know why you're such a proponent of quota systems.
Quota systems are good. I mean, I think that, again, Burundi was used as an example of that happening. I mean, in the last few years, about 14 years that I've been going to Burundi, I've been very proud of what they've been able to achieve in terms of removing the ethnic tensions that were there before the different wars that happened. I mean, now the Hutus and the Tutsis actually laugh about this ethnicity, you know. It's amazing.
Because it feels like in South Africa, like our old tensions are getting less and less funny.
No, actually, you know, it's interesting because like a country like Rwanda have taken a different approach. I mean, they have decided that everybody's Rwandan, there's no ethnicity, and actually they discourage the discussions of ethnicity. But in Burundi, they've taken an approach that yes, there is Hutus, there is Tutsis. If we can come together and agree that we can share power, we can come together and not actually shine away from this, we can actually heal from it. And it's really been impressive when I see, I mean, an example is when I was in Bujumbura a little while back and I was in traffic and somebody says, to a group of guys that were on top of a truck, and they says, tell those Hutus to come down because they might get hurt. And everybody just laughed about it.
Wow.
And then that's how
you know you've really healed when you can finally laugh about it.
That's right, because even in another instance, I was in a restaurant, and at that time, I think we had a few gunshots from, I think, theft or something. And one guy out of nowhere in the restaurant just says, I think those bullets are coming for me because I'm the only Tutsi around here. And everybody laughed. So I think that these are the things that really can show you that a society has healed when they can actually laugh about it. So Burundi has really been impressive in this regards.
I definitely applaud Burundi for overcoming this obstacle. Hopefully other countries with similar predicaments can emulate that. I don't think that for a country like Nigeria, I don't think enough is being done for victims of Boko Haram because they've gone through a lot of, trauma, rape, I mean, death. It's just a lot. However, one organization that has been able to do that is Neem Foundation, and it has partnered with the only psychiatric hospital in the northeastern region of Nigeria, which is kind of pathetic because you can't just have one. And they're trying to help those victims. But then there's another one called the Future Process Islamic Foundation in Maiduguri, Nigeria, which has also been set up for Boko Haram widows and their children. So in that aspect, they are, but I just feel like there needs to be a lot more done, especially because these are just NGOs and individuals doing the best that they can.
And we also need to normalize getting help. Like, we need to normalize getting psychological assistance, seeing therapists, seeing psychiatrists. I was talking to a psychiatrist in South Sudan, and she told me that she didn't have any friends because no one wants to be seen with her because the stigma of mental illness is so strong that if they're seen with her, it makes it seem like they also need help. And I think that that's an injustice to the victims even.
It reminds me of that old saying, if you want peace, work for justice. Look, I think the emotional and psychological recovery and all of this is extremely important, but I also believe that nothing cures all our ills like a good economy. And if you want peace in Africa, you want to see an end to terrorism, then invest in Africa's development. I was looking at a study by the UN Office, a 2017 study by the UN Office on counter-terrorism, and they interviewed former jihadists in Europe, in the Middle East and North Africa. And what they found were that these were young people drawn to these terrorist groups who came from communities that were on the socio-economic periphery of their respective countries. They felt excluded, they felt like they didn't belong, and they just didn't feel economically integrated in their countries. And I think if you give people good quality jobs, if you give them opportunity, that way you can start restoring their dignity. You can give them a sense of place and a sense of belonging in their home countries, in their communities, and that can really help people recover. That's how we start helping people reintegrate. And I think that will also make young people less vulnerable to these terrorist groups in the first place. And people who are part of a solid middle class, people who have happy, bright futures ahead of them, are much less likely, I think, to blow up themselves or even blow up other people.
That's very true. Political will is very key in these issues because, I mean, helping people cope with psychological effects of war is very key when the government actually takes the forefront in these, in helping people heal. Because a lot of times in different African nations, many African nations, these are issues that are swept under the rug. And I think that if we acknowledge that getting help is, like you said, important, I think it will be really good in terms of healing for the people.
And women are also key in this fight. After the break, we'll introduce you to some women to watch. We'll be asking for your opinion on women who are on the front lines against terrorism in Africa. We'll be back in a moment.
Welcome back. This is Our Voices. Now it's time for our Women to Watch segment, which highlights African women on the continent and in the diaspora who are doing extraordinary things.
Fawzia Abdi is the founder and president of Kenya's Women in International Security Horn of Africa and chairwoman of Sisters Without Borders, a network of Kenyan organizations devoted to the prevention of violent extremism. She and her partners developed the network to help individuals who are working on countering violent extremism. Abdi says perceptions have shifted since she started working on the issue, and women are no longer assumed to be innocent victims or bystanders within extremist groups. Abdi is calling for a much more sophisticated approach to the problem.
We're also watching the 10 girls of AMISOM, roughly 500 women in Uganda who are the true definition of girl power, risking their lives for the liberation of Somalia against Al-Shabaab. The battle-hardened Ugandan girls are not just heroes in Somalia. They are seen as saviors as they protect women and children, not just from Al-Shabaab, but also from the rogue AMISOM soldiers who at times commit rape and abuse against the local communities.
Nikita Malik is an internationally recognized expert on youth de-radicalization and countering hate-based violence. As the director of the Center of Radicalization and Terrorism, she watches for extremist material online, including social media, as well as areas not seen by the general public. The EU, the US, and the United Nations cite her work. She partners with top NGOs, including Save the Children and Child Soldiers, to deliver high-impact programs on youth and radicalization. In 2018, Forbes magazine named her a key influencer in law and policy. Malik is a woman to watch because she's watching out for how technology plays a role in the radicalization of young people.
Well, she's a Somali-Canadian social activist, and her name is Ilwat Elman, and she spends her time de-radicalizing members of Al-Shabaab. Elman works for the counter-radicalization network Extremely Together at the Kofi Annan Foundation, and she comes from very good stock. Her mother founded the Elman Peace and Human Rights Center in Mogadishu. Her father was a peace activist known as Somalia's father of peace. He's believed to have coined the phrase, "drop the gun, pick up the pen," and he was assassinated in 1996, and now Elman is working to carry on that family legacy. That's really, really hard to beat, all those amazing accomplishments. And of course, we want to hear who you think is a woman to watch. Use the hashtag VOA Our Voices and tell us her story. We'd like to hear more about the gutsy women who are fighting to end violent extremism on the continent.
Be sure to also watch Our Voices on the VOA website, where you can find the world's top news stories.
We leave you with a quote from Pastor Esther Ibanga, the president and founder of Women Without Walls, an interfaith organization based in Jos, Nigeria, that brings Christian and Muslim women together to campaign for peace. Pastor Ibanga used her voice to say, "All over the world, women have become targets of violent extremism. We are kidnapped and become sex slaves. They come to our very bedrooms and kill us. So we have every legitimate right and moral right to be involved in finding the solutions to violent extremism."
And that's our final word for this week. On behalf of the Voice of America and along with my colleagues, thanks for tuning into Our Voices. Good day.